Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Today we have a special travel log presented by my husband, Gurudutt, and he'll take you around. You'll see which are the places he's going to take you around. Go ahead, Gurudutt. Unmute yourself and start.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have not met most of you. I'm usually known as Shanta's husband. I'm Gurudutt. I have the same last name as Shanta. Nobody laughed. Anyway, she asked me to walk you folks through this Russia or Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, and Eastern Europe capitals. We took this trip about 10 years ago, just one sec. About 11 years ago, we call the same, I'm calling the same name as a Cossack explorer. Cossacks are a group of people predominantly in central Russia, Ural Mountains, around that range. They're known as one of the first earliest, the ethnogenomics folks say that Cossacks are the people who tamed or domesticated animals, particularly horses. So they called it Cossack Explorer. And this was a trip that was about 16, 17 days, I think, through 9 cities and 7 different countries, 18 days actually, roughly 4,000 kilometers. Actually, Toronto to Vancouver is about 4,000 kilometers, the same distance. We covered that in 18 days. It's a coach trip. It was all through by bus, except for a short hop between Sweden and Finland on a ferry, overnight ferry. It starts in Copenhagen. So I'll walk you through first Copenhagen, then we go to Stockholm from there, then we go from there, we go to Helsinki, then from there to St. Petersburg, Novgorod, Moscow, Minsk, Belarus, Warsaw, Poland, and finally end in Berlin. So it starts in Copenhagen. Copenhagen, as you know, I don't know how many of you have visited Copenhagen, is one of the nicest countries on this planet. It's a Scandinavian country, small country, only less than 6 million people, I think 5.8 million, with an area of less than Nova Scotia, about 3/4 size of Nova Scotia, but it's one of the highest, very high standard of living and very high quality of life, if you will. It's a model society, so to say, for everyone. So we land in Copenhagen. Denmark is a parliamentary democracy or monarchy, if you probably know, just like England or even Canada for that matter. Although we have the Governor General, we don't have a monarch. We do have a monarch in a way. So it's a constitutional hereditary monarchy. And this buildings, you see the building complexes in front of you in the picture. These are the Danish royal family residences. They call it Amalienborg Palace. There are complexes of about 4 buildings. Now, the Danish royal family is not wealthy like British royal family. They don't own much of the properties they live in, including the palaces. They are owned by the Danish people, if you will. And they get an allowance or a stipend every year in the budget sanctioned by the Parliament of Denmark. This is Amalienborg Palace. As you see, there's hardly any security around this. You don't see any cops with guns drawn and all. It's one of the safest countries on this planet. There are 4 different residences which the Danish government lives in. This is the next one. This is called Fredensborg Palace. Then this is the Frederiksborg Palace or castle, if you will. And this is the front of the same Frederiksborg Castle. And this is inside of that Frederiksborg Castle. Very opulent surroundings, but this is essentially treated for all the state functions like treating foreign dignitaries and so on. Those of you who are Shakespeare aficionados, Hamlet was based on this particular Kronsborg Castle, which is in a place called Elsinore. In the northern tip of Denmark, which is also an entry point to the Baltic Sea. So it's a very strategically located castle. This is another view of the same castle. This is the Opera House in Copenhagen. And then finally, before we leave Copenhagen, you probably have heard of the mermaid on the ocean, Little Mermaid, statue of the mermaid, if you will, in Copenhagen, very famous one, famous site. And this is what we saw when we went to see that. They had taken it to some expo in Shanghai, so it was sitting there, and instead of that, they put a screen, as you see on the right, top right corner, which also wasn't showing anything at all. Instead of we got to see this couple taking a pictures there. Then from Copenhagen, we go to Sweden. It's about 680 kilometers between Stockholm and between Copenhagen and Stockholm. It's the second longest drive. You know, after when we went in the beginning, I told you we traveled roughly around 4,000 kilometers in 16, 17 days. Some days we had very long bus rides, which were not unpleasant at all, because although the bus was supposed to carry around 40 people, we were hardly 23 or 22 people on the bus. And half of them were probably 3/4 of them from Australians, very rowdy, noisy bunch, and then few Canadian families and few Americans. So it was on the whole, it was a very fairly pleasant journey, if you will. Now, most of the Sweden is covered by very similar topography, very similar geography as ours, full of lakes and forests, and whichever way you look at. Like if you blindfold me and drop me there, I would think I'll be somewhere between Barrie and Paris Sound, if you will. It's very similar to our flora and fauna. Now, we have to cross the Gulf of the Baltic Sea. Now, there's a bridge called Olesund Bridge. This is an engineering marvel. It's about 8 kilometers from Malmo to an artificial island, which is some 8 kilometers from there. And from there, it goes underground to all the way to Copenhagen, if you will. On Netflix a few years ago, there was a show called The Bridge. It was a crime thriller. A murder victim lies with her half body in Sweden and half in Denmark, if you will. It was an interesting story. Anyway, it's an engineering marvel. We couldn't take any pictures of this because we can't stop on the bridge. It's very fast moving traffic. Now, Sweden is very similar to Denmark in every respect. It's a very egalitarian society, very high standard of living, very high quality of life. Hardly any guns, very low crime rate. It's also parliamentary democracy, a constitutional democracy, and surprisingly, for a very peaceful country, they're also 9th largest arms exporter. Much of their economy is engineering, manufacturing. Like we see only Volvo cars, but they make a lot of manufacturing engineering products, including aircrafts and fighter jets and so on. This is the second longest trip we had. I'm sorry. This is the second longest. No, it's not second. We drove into Stockholm. Now, Stockholm is a city built on several islands in the Baltic Sea. It's always, you look around any way, there is water, you see water. Very clean, very organized, very disciplined city. This is a Stockholm Royal Palace, official resident of King Carl Gustaf and his wife, Queen Sylvia. It's on the island called Stadsholmen, if you will. And this is the National Museum of Fine Arts. We didn't get to see that because our guide said that there's not much to be seen there. This is the Nobel Museum, Alfred Nobel Prize. You know, Sweden gives Nobel Prizes annually. There are 6 prizes given for physics, chemistry, mathematics, peace, and economics and literature. This prize is awarded in the Stockholm City Hall. Now this is out from an outside view, and this is a place where the award ceremony takes place. It's a pretty big, although it looks a little small in this, it can accommodate as many as 300 people. And only the Peace Prize is awarded in Oslo, in Norway, not in Stockholm. The reason is Alfred Nobel. At that time, Norway was part of Sweden. Sweden actually ruled Norway in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And Alfred Nobel, in his will, said that Peace Prize should be given because Norway deserves independence. And soon after that, Norway became an independent country. But the Peace Prize continues to be awarded in Oslo. This is the hall, banquet hall, where after the award ceremony is over, the banquet is held here. It's a very opulent construction. There's not much to see in Sweden other than it's a very organized, very orderly, a very nice city to live in. And from there, next we go on to Finland. Now, we have to take a ferry to cross the Gulf of Bothnia, I think it's called. Yeah, it's in a 16-hour ferry journey between Stockholm and Helsinki. We leave around late afternoon, and next morning we are in Finland. One of the interesting stories about this ferry trip is we knew we had a cabin to ourselves. We didn't bother to find out what type of cabin it is, what type of ferry it is. It turned out that cabin was below the deck. There were no windows. And once you shut the door and switch off the light, it's pitch dark. Only hum you hear is of the engine. I have claustrophobia, mild claustrophobia. Anything is, in closed spaces, I get scared. And much of the night, luckily enough, we were very tired, so could sleep. Anyway, next morning we arrive in Finland. Now, Finland is not a Scandinavian country. Generally, misconception is Finland is Scandinavia. There are only 4 Scandinavian countries: Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The Finnish people are ethnically same as what happened here? Finnish people are ethnically same as those from Lithuania or Estonia or Hungary. The Finnish language is very close to Hungarian. Although it's part of the Indo-European language families, it's not similar to Swedish or Norwegian. Swedish, Norwegian, German, Dutch, Danish, they're all called what is called as Germanic languages, part of the larger Indo-European language groups. But Finnish is quite different. Finnish resembles more Hungarian and Lithuanian or Estonian. Finland is also one of the very nicer countries, very safe country, and they also have very high standard of living, very high quality of life. And this is this monument for Sibelius. Sibelius was one of Jean Sibelius was a Finnish composer who was treated as a national treasure because Finland at that time, during his birth, it was ruled by Prussian Empire, or Germany ruled over it. It was not an independent nation. At the end of First World War, when Germany lost the World War, only at that time Finland got an independence and it became an independent country. So his music, essentially, he was a composer, Western music composer, and he's treated as a national treasure, and for independent Finland, he gave an image, if you will. This is in the part of the park in Finland. This is the Helsinki Cathedral. It was built sometime around 1830s or between 1830 and 1850s, around that time. It was a gift by Tsar Nicholas of Russia. This is another Eastern Orthodox church, Uspensky Cathedral. It's called Uspensky Cathedral. Again, there are not too many sites to be seen. It's a nice country. It's a drive-through country. So we spent just 1 one day there, and next day we started for St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, this is about 6 hours, roughly 6 hours drive from Helsinki to St. Petersburg. It's an interesting experience. This road, you see the road is, now it's, although the picture says 4 hours, 46 minutes, that's the driving time, but typically you would spend about at least 1.5 to 2 hours on the border here. Now, why we do that? Because we have to disturb the Russian border guards or customs pay folks, if you will. There was hardly any traffic. We got there around mid-morning, maybe around 10:30ish or 11 that time. And finally, the customs agent, Russian customs agent, decided to do us a favor and come, and one by one he started skimming through, turning each page of our passport books. Then they checked the bus with a mirror underneath the bus and everything and so on. So it was a very elaborate process, if you will. And the road itself is single lane. It's not a highway. And we arrive in St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, as you know, Russia is the largest country geographically, the largest landmass. It's 11 time zones, and it's twice the size of Canada, about almost 18 million square kilometers in area, twice that of Canada. Canada is around 9,000 square kilometers. It's about a country of 130, 135 people, and vast majority of the population live west of Ural Mountains. Ural Mountains go from Kazakhstan, eastern Kazakhstan border, all the way up to this. Can you see my cursor? Can you see you can see my cursor?
Yeah,
okay.
I can see.
Your cursor, okay. Kazakhstan border all the way up to Arctic Ocean. And vast majority of roughly about 80% of the population lives west of that. This Moscow, St. Petersburg, all the cities come within that area. Siberia itself, the eastern part is Siberia. Siberia is very sparsely populated. And the country was founded by a person by the name of Rurik. There's some debate as to what his origins are. Some say it's Finnish, some say it's Scandinavian, and so on. In the 9th century, it's one of the continuous nation states. It's been in existence as a country since 9th century, along with Britain and a few, not too many countries have retained that continuity all through years. Then in around 16th century, one of the duchies, like duchies is a subordinate state to the larger empire, if you will. The Moscow duchy, it was managed by at that time a fellow by the name of Ivan IV. He took over when the Rus dynasty faded away. He founded the House of Romanovs, or Tsardom, until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. 1917, Communist Lenin came and they essentially murdered most of the Tsarist family, if you will, at the end of 1917, 1918, and so on, and communism took over. So it's called Tsarist and Peter the Great was recognized as the greatest of all Tsars. He lived somewhere late 17th century, I think between 1680 and 1730 or around that time. He expanded that empire, Russian Empire or Tsarist Empire, all the way up to Pacific. Now, there was some kind of a rules, kings and so on, but there was no formal organized kingdom or a monarchy in eastern part of what is today's eastern part of Russia, Siberia, and so on. So they expanded it all the way up to Pacific region. It's a semi-presidential constitutional republic with the president and prime minister share power. If you recall, at one time, there was a very well-known prime minister called Medvedev, and he and Putin used to trade musical chairs. He became president, other fellow became prime minister. After that, Putin became prime minister and this fellow became president, and now Putin is prime minister, president again, and he will be president until at least 1930. I'm sorry, 2030. It's an upper middle income country, Russia. They've got tremendous amount of natural resources, oil, gas, minerals, forestry. But for the pre-glasnost or pre-1990 Russia, when everything was state-owned, the productivity being extremely low, it was never a rich nation. Then, if you recall, the Gorbachev became the president, and he called it glasnost, or openness, and essentially Russian Empire, if you will. All the federations under Russia, they all became independent countries. They went through gut-wrenching economic change. There was a lot of upheaval within the country at that time. But later on, it was supposed to come back, but then Putin came back. He's not a very popular guy in the West, and so it's a little bit of everything. I mean, they do reasonably well. At the same time, they could do far better than what they do today. St. Petersburg was a city founded by Peter the Great. That's why it was called Petrograd initially, then later on renamed as St. Petersburg because in the name of Peter the Great. It became the capital when Tsars moved. When he built that city, sometime in late, I think, early 1700s, when he built the city, they moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and it remained the capital of Russia until World War I, think, until the Bolshevik Revolution. When Lenin took over, at that time they moved it back to Moscow. So it has all the trimmings of a very rich kingdom, Tsarist. We'll see this. There are several sites to be seen. Actually, St. Petersburg is a place with a lot of palaces, museums, and cathedrals, and parks, and so on. Typically you need about at least 5 to 6 days to see everything. Like everywhere it happens, you don't get, you have very little time, and it's so much to see. We spent there, I think, 2 days and 3 nights, if I recall. Yeah, 2 days, I think we were there. The places to see there are the Summer Palace. I'm having some problem here. Okay, now these are all the palaces, different palaces. There are about half a dozen, 4 or 5 different palaces here. And this Hermitage Museum is one of the palaces. It was called Summer Palace. There's a place called Winter Palace inside. This is a park, and then there's a Summer Palace. And there's Peter and Paul Fortress. These are the 5 sites we visited. Then there is another 5th site, which is called Petrov Palace in the Gulf of Finland. This is the winter palace of Tsars. It's about 40 kilometers from St. Petersburg proper. All right. In St. Petersburg, this is the statue of Peter the Great, commissioned by his grandson's wife, Catherine the Great. Russian Tsars were not very imaginative as far as names go. Peter and Catherine keeps reoccurring again and again. So his grandson was also Peter, and his wife was Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great was also seen among one of the very effective Tsarist rulers. She created this from a single rock. This rock is said to weigh something like 200 tons, or I don't know how they brought it and so on. Now, this is St. Isaac's Cathedral, one of the largest architectural landmarks within the downtown area. They don't call it downtown, they call it Senate Square of St. Petersburg. It was, at that time, there was some construction going on. We could go inside and see. One of the things you'll notice if you visit our Russia is you plan to go for a tourist site and suddenly you find it suddenly closed. There is for some reason without explanation. So it's very often it happens in Russia, I'm told. This is a Church of Savior on Spilled Blood, that is called in Russian exact translation. It is a Russian Orthodox Church in St. Petersburg. Christ the Savior. There, Shanta tells me it's called, yeah, Christ the Savior. Yeah. All right. Now, this is a statue of Catherine the Great. Catherine II. She was born in Poland. She's a Polish lady who married Peter the Great's grandson, and she actually solidified the Tsarist rule across the very vast land. Just imagine, this was even the days before the railways came in, and horses and horse carriages were the only means of transport in those days. To go across 11 time zones and to go all the way right up to Pacific Ocean from European border, Western European border, if you will. It's such a vast land, but she expanded the empire all the way to Pacific, solidified her control. Now, this is called rostral columns. You'll find that there are lots of bridges in St. Petersburg. Every bridge, these are on both sides of the bridge. If you as you enter, as you come out, these columns you'll find. These are, I believe, they're called victory columns, and they originated in ancient Greece, were directed to commemorate a naval and military victory. But some festive occasions, they light up all these places. These things, what you see here, they light them up. So you'll find them on every bridge. Now, there are two pictures of this I've inserted just to give you a clear view. These are stock pictures. They were not taken by me. So this is one of those pictures. This is called Peter and Paul Cathedral, if you will, right here. See, it's a very magnificent architecture. It was built as a fortress to invasions, but it was never used for a military purposes. It was mainly used for political prisoners by czars. And when communists or after Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, they opened it up for other purposes, if you will. Now, this is the church inside there. There are a lot of churches. One thing about Russian communism, if you will, unlike in other countries when there's a revolution, they did not destroy any of their monuments or the past architecture or anything. They preserved them. They kept them very well, except many of the churches, because they're atheist country, if you will, and communism is atheist. And except instead of using it for religious purposes, they started using it tourist sites and so on. Though many of them have been returned since glasnost back to for religious purposes, but they still continue to be tourist site. This is the Church of Peter and Paul. And this is probably how Peter the Great looked like, although I don't know who that lady standing next to him is, but this is how Peter the Great looked like. Now, these are series of palaces, which I showed you in that map, if you will. There is a small hermitage, old hermitage, new hermitage, winter palace, and summer palace. And this is the inside of that palace. Part of it again was closed, and so we could not go to every site. We could not visit inside the palace or Hermitage Museum even. But Hermitage Museum is said to have a very vast collection of treasures, Russian as well as other European treasures. Although they don't have from Asia or Africa, like they were not colonial. Russians were never colonized, so they don't have those exhibits like British Museum or Louvre Museum in Paris. Now this is the floor of that. It's a very elaborate mosaic made of wood as well as ivory and so on. So they don't allow you to walk with shoes on this. They give you shoe coverings. You have to put them on and before you walk there. As you can see, it's very opulent in terms of architecture, and as well as it has been very well preserved and maintained, every bit of it. Next, we go to this place, Petrov Palace. It's about 40 kilometers drive from there. On way, we stopped at this place called Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul. This is another Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul. These are the patron saints of Tsars, if you will. I think Emperor, one of the Tsars, Alexander II or something like that, he constructed that. From that, we arrive at this fabulous place called Petrov Palace, right on the Gulf of Finland. Now, Peter the Great visited France, Paris, during the time of Louis XVI. And those of you who have been to Paris probably have visited Versailles Palace. He was so impressed by Versailles Palace and the Paris architecture and so on. So he wanted to emulate that. So he went on to build something very similar to Versailles Palace with, if you recall, if you know, Versailles is full of gardens and mansions, magnificent mansions, so on. So this place, Petrov Palace is also, the Summer Palace is also very similar to that. There are a lot of gardens and fabulous architecture. As you see, these are all very well preserved, if you will. Now, you see people waiting here, and we were also waiting there. This area before 10 o'clock, I think it was at 10 o'clock, is nothing at all. At 10 o'clock, suddenly all the fountains, these are all the fountains you can see here and here and here. So they all start at one point, but we took pictures before that. This is from the palace balcony. This is the Gulf of Finland, all the way. You could sail into that. These bridges were not there apparently. The kings their yachts used to come right up to here. They've got very magnificent gardens around the place. And now the fountains, they all come on at the same time. This is inside of the palace. Very opulent and again, very well preserved. Just imagine, to maintain this, it's a gold paint. You have to keep it painted at least every few years, every now and then. This was the dressing room of Tsarinos, if you will. Now, that's the end of St. Petersburg. From there, we go to a place called Novgorod. Now, Novgorod is the oldest seat of Kingdom of Russia. It was founded by a person by the name of Rurik in 9th century. Again, there's a debate, as I said before, whether he was a Russian or whether he was Finnish or Scandinavian, don't know. But he's the one who set up this kingdom sometime in 9th century. And this is a statue. This is one of the administrative buildings. You see this architecture, the very drab, square, everything with sharp corners and all, is called Stalinistic architecture. Stalin wanted efficiency. He didn't want any kind of, and there is no finesse into it. It's very efficient, construct, build, and maintain probably. But they constructed something like 9 buildings. They call it wedding cake architecture or something like that. Anyway, we'll come to that a bit later. This is one of the oldest churches in Europe. This was built again around 9th or 10th century, Cathedral of Saint Sophia. It's got 5 domes. We can see only 4 here. 1 dome is behind us. Now, the story of Russia is not complete without looking into the effects of Second World War in particular, on Eastern European countries. We hear a lot about war, what happened in France, what Churchill did, and how Germany was defeated, how Americans helped, and the Canadians also were there, and so on. But the countries that suffered most during Second World War were all these Eastern European countries, Russia, Poland, Belarus. Novgorod in particular lost something like fully 1/3 or 125% to 30% of its population. During the end of the war, there were hardly any males between the age of 16 and 60 living in Novgorod, because Novgorod was right in the front line. I didn't, when we talked about St. Petersburg, I didn't talk about the siege of Leningrad or siege of St. Petersburg. It was called Leningrad at that time. The Nazi army from the south, Novgorod is to the south of St. Petersburg, completely blockaded that city. And from the north, the Finnish military blockaded that. Now, Finland, although was not part of Nazi Axis, it was allied with the West, if you will, the Western powers. They had no particular love for Russia, because Tsars ruled Finland until the Bolshevik Revolution. It was part of Russian Empire. Finland was not an independent country until 1917. So they blockaded from the north for fully about 2 years, almost for 2 years. The city of St. Petersburg was starved, and nearly half the population, something like 300,000 people died in St. Petersburg, mainly because of starvation, disease, and hypothermia. It was one of the worst experiences of war, but it's not much of it talked about in the West. This is one of the war memorials, and every part of the city, every city you go there, you see those war memorials in Eastern Europe. This is another of the war, this Afghan war memorial that Russians did this adventure in Afghanistan, just like Americans did. So this is yet another of those. So we were there overnight in Novgorod, and from there we move on to Moscow. As you know, Moscow is now the capital of Russia, and it's a city of 12 million residents within the city itself proper. And if you take the surrounding neighborhood commuting areas, it's roughly about 20 million. So it's one of the largest metropolis in the world. And in Europe, Western Europe in particular, Moscow is the largest city in that country. It's about 20 million people. Originally established sometime around 1100, 1120 by as a duchy of Moscow, which is part of which eventually became the Tsarist Empire. The prominent site in Moscow is the Kremlin, and the Kremlin is a complex, a series of complex, and this is the entrance to the Kremlin. The bridge you see, the one you see here, is the moat. See, this is the bridge. That's the entrance to this door is the entrance to Kremlin, and you see here, this is the moat that covers all surrounds entire Kremlin complex. This is a subway station. I'll show you some pictures of the subway. That's one of the sites worth seeing, the Moscow subway. This is the bridge that connects to the Kremlin complex. This is the arsenal. It's called Kremlin Arsenal. It's the military headquarters. All the military machinations takes place inside this building. It's inside that Kremlin complex. It's not open to tourists. This is a Tsar cannon. Largest known cannon exists in the world. It's something like, it weighs like something like 50 or say 60 tons, cast of bronze, and I believe it was fired only once. And it's right again in the walls of Kremlin. And this is another very interesting site. Now, Shanta is trying to put that back, the broken one. She didn't succeed. It still remains broken. It's about 20 22 feet in diameter and 25 feet in height. It's very, I don't know how they cast it. It was cast of bronze, single cast, it's made of bronze. Now within the Kremlin complex, there are 5 cathedrals and churches, 3 cathedrals and 2 churches. I was one curious as to what's the difference between cathedral and a church. I believe cathedral is where there's a bishop and church is where regularly you meet for services. This is the entrance to what they call it Cathedral Square. So this entrance to that Cathedral Square, and this is the Cathedral Square. This site is today, even today, for swearing in of President of Russia or Prime Minister or the Chief Justice of Russian court is held in this particular square. This is Cathedral of Annunciation, another 13th or 14th century construction. This is Church of 12 Apostles. All these silver domes. You see the silver domes on this. And this is the Cathedral of Dormition. Another view of the same cathedral. And the Church of Cathedral of Archangel. Another view of the same. This is Cathedral of Annunciation, again within the complex. This is outside the complex, outside that cathedral square. This is but within the Kremlin, overall Kremlin complex. This is Kazan Cathedral. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Russians are not very religious folks, but nonetheless, they've preserved all this extremely well. Now, this is the cathedral, Kremlin, overall Kremlin grounds. Now, behind this, there's a Lenin mausoleum. Again, we could not visit that, Lenin's tomb, because there's some function was going to be held, so there was some construction going on, so that was blocked off. This is the famous landmark of Moscow, St. Basil's Cathedral. Built around 16th century. Ivan the Terrible, he was the earliest Tsar who established the House of Romanovs. So he constructed that for his victory over Kazakhstan, one of the neighboring communities. Another picture of the same. It's a very scenic view, particularly at night. This is the Kremlin grounds. Inside this, the president's office and all the ministries, KGB, well, the equivalent to present day KGB, they all have Red Square. This house called Red Square, yeah. Another view of the Red Square. With the St. Basil's Cathedral in the background. This is that Parliament building. They call it White House in Russian, although because it's painted white. The Parliament, the Prime Minister's office, they all sit here. Now, this is the University of Moscow. This is again one of the Stalinistic architecture. They call it the wedding cake architecture because it's layered. There's one layer here, second layer here, third layer here, and so on. Now, Moscow University is one of the largest universities on this planet, with about, I think, 40,000 students, full-time students. Now, they have a very large research facility, and they won a number of Nobel Prizes and so on. Much of the science, and particularly in sciences, may not be as much as in humanities, but in sciences, it's very. The only reason why the Western students don't get to attend that or they don't go there is because of language difficulty. But Russian is unlike Western European or Germanic languages. It's not easy to learn, and even the script is a Cyrillic script. in France or Germany, we can read the road signs because the script is Roman script, but scribbled for that reason. Now, the next picture is again a stock picture. I did not take that, but the only reason I'm putting that on is to give you an idea as to the sheer size of this complex. That is, so there are something like 5,000 rooms and about all the corridors. If you measure, they have something like 350 kilometers of corridors. They constructed 7 buildings. Stalin ordered 7 buildings of this nature constructed. And this is the next one is a converted hotel, Radisson Hotel. Now, this is the cemetery. This is very similar to Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C. This is where most of the dignitaries are buried. It's this entrance to that cemetery. This is Yeltsin's tomb. Now, Boris Yeltsin ruled over Russia soon after Gorbachev, when the country was in transition from communism or a controlled economy into a free market economy. It was an extremely chaotic decade, if you will. There was a lot of poverty, distribution, if you will. So he was, and Yeltsin himself was an alcoholic and was not a very popular president. So probably they didn't make a big monument for him. The next one is Raisa Gorbachev. His wife is buried here. Gorbachev is still alive, by the way. He's in his 90s, early 90s, lives in Natasha on one of the lakes nearby. Now, this is Khrushchev of the Cuban Missile Crisis fame. Those of us who remember missile crisis when he positioned intercontinental ballistic missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy gave an ultimatum: either you pull those out or we're going to bomb those. So world came very close to Third World War. Next we see is the subway system. Now, one of the fascinating things about subway system is extraordinarily clean, and there is a lot of art in the subway stations. Now, Moscow subway is a very extensive subway, not as big as probably London Underground or even New York's subway system, but nonetheless, it's something like 300 miles of tracks and nearly 250 stations and so on. So, but every I don't know if every station is decorated the same way, but this was one of the main stations. You can see all the how Stalin, Uncle Stalin is Uncle Lenin is here. See, like this, you see this art painted on subway walls. This is another interesting thing about almost many European sites have this. There's something like you touch the dog and your luck will change. Okay, next week from there we go to Minsk. Now this is the longest bus ride we had, almost 10 hours, at about 700 kilometers, single lane road. Now, Republic of Belarus translates into White Russia. The exact translation is Belarus is White Russia. So Mongols, if you remember history, the Mongols from Mongolia, they invaded much of the northern parts, the Siberia. From then they moved into Russia. Then they went all the way up to France, if you will. In most places they settled down. So that genes are mixed with the local population. But they say in Belarus, they never put roads. So the Belarusian people are the original Slavic people. So that's why they call it White Russia. Whereas Russians, average Russian, particularly as you go to the West, there's a lot of Mongol blood in them. So that's been proven later on also through genetic studies as well. So Belarus is a republic. It's a communist dictatorship, if you will, by the Lukashenko, who's been in power for such a long time. Recently, you probably read about in papers that he lost election but couldn't do much. Now, this is a monument to Second World War again. Now, Belarus, as I said before, lost about 25% of its population in Second World War. because it was right on the path of Nazi armies that marched into Russia. Now, Belarus also sent a lot of soldiers to Afghanistan when Russia did its misadventure in Afghanistan. And this is the monument to those places. This is their central library, and they're very proud of this, Belarusians. Other than this, there's not much to see in Belarus proper. From there, we move on to Warsaw. It's about 6.5 hours bus ride. Poland is again, which is part of the Russian influence country before, and now it's an independent country, part of European Union. It's a mid-level economy, and right now their current government is moved back to a little bit of a dictatorial right-wing government. Now this fellow, Joseph Pilsudski, Poland was ruled by Germany until First World War, until 1914, 1915. And this person essentially led the movement to make Poland independent. And when Germany lost First World War, Poland became an independent country. This is Chopin. You know, Chopin was Polish, the composer, the famous pianist composer. He was. This is Chopin's statue in Warsaw. This is a palace. One of the Polish, the early Polish. No, there are no kings. It's a parliamentary democracy. Poland again suffered a great deal in Second World War. About 15% to 15 to 20% of the population died during the Second World War. This is another memorial, war memorial. Another sad part of Polish history is what is called as a Holocaust, their contribution to Holocaust, if you will. Before the Second World War started, when Nazis, with the Nazi influence, they pushed all the Jewish population into what they call as a Jewish ghetto within Poland. And there was an uprising, and this is a monument to that. From Warsaw, we moved to Berlin. This is the last leg of our trip. This is about 570 kilometers roughly, and not a bad drive, reasonably good drive. In Berlin itself, Berlin became when Germany united in 1990, I think around that time, East Germany and West Germany came together. Berlin again regained its prominence, because before that, Bonn was capital of West Germany, and East German capital was Berlin. But Berlin was part of the East Germany, so Berlin was a divided city. At the end of the war, all these powers like France, Britain, and the United States and Russia got together and divided the city into sectors: American sector, British sector, and so on. So, but after 1990, when West Germany and East Germany united, it became Berlin became the capital again, and Berlin rose to prominence once again. Now there are a few Reichstag, which is their old parliament and present parliament, if you will. There's a Holocaust Memorial and Brandenburg Gate. The federal. These are a few sites to be seen in within. What happened? I went somewhere else. Can you see? I don't know. This Latuka? I don't see anything.
Yes, I can see. I can see the map. I can't see the rest of the things.
All right.
Go to the next.
All right. Here we are. Okay. This is Reichstag. This is the original German parliament before.
We can't see the picture. We can't see the picture.
All right. I don't know what I did then. Chika, help me. Now, how about now? How about now?
Yes, we can see it. We can see it now. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. This is what Reichstag, right, which was the parliament before Hitler took over, which the Nazi party took over. And this was damaged actually in fire. This is not a war effect. But after Hitler became dictator of Germany, essentially he started ruling from his house. There was no parliament or anything at all. So it fell into disuse. And later on, when Germany was freed after Second World War, Bonn became the capital. But when Germany united, this became the parliament house once again. This is where the German parliament meets. This is Angela Merkel's office, the executive offices in Berlin. This is the famous Brandenburg Gate. This was the dividing line between East Germany and West Germany. One behind this gate is all what used to be East Germany. You can see there are two buildings on the left and right side, which are drab Russian style construction architecture. These are built after the war. So this gate itself was built sometime around, I think, 17th century Prussian kingdom at that time. But this is the important landmark. This is called Church of the Hollow Tooth. It's shaped in a tooth. The spire of the church was bombed during the war, and they constructed something else there. But it's a very well-known landmark in Berlin downtown. So where do you want to meet? Say the Church of the Hollow Tooth. This is the Berlin Wall. They kept only small pieces of it for tourists. Much of the wall has been torn down. Now, this is again for the tourists. As I said, Berlin was a divided city among four powers, and there were a Russian sector and American sector, British sector, and this was Checkpoint Charlie. And there were barbed wires running through across. So these are just there for the tourist trap. Again, this is for the tourists. This is the Holocaust Memorial. See, much of the German Jewish population was annihilated before Second World War. And underneath this, at the lower level, which is not allowed, I think you have to book an appointment, and it's not easy to enter that for some reason. They have listed the names of 3 million or so people who were sent to the death camps. Now, this is Potsdam. It's one of the palaces there. Potsdam was the place where Sicilianov. This is a place where the Potsdam Conference was held after war, at the end of the war, where Churchill first and then Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, who took over from Churchill, then the American president and the Stalin, they met for 3 months how to set up the post-war Germany and post-war Western governance, if you will. This is a place where they met. Now that brings us, this is the last picture of the presentation. So you can keep the mic open if anybody has questions. Mahesh?
Yeah. You can stop sharing. Get out of sharing. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I had to twist his arm and make sure he comes and helps me to do the social. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gurudutt, for doing this. And now if people like it, then probably I'll ask you in future to do other places too. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Mahesh, can you unmute everybody?
Yes, everybody can unmute yourself.
You're very